Ukraine's attack on Russia. Is Ukraine now the aggressor? Can Ukraine hold out? German tanks on Russian territory? Are we now suddenly a belligerent? I am Captain Jan Scharnitzky and welcome you to Nachgefragt.
Ukrainian troops have unexpectedly advanced into Russian territory in the Kursk region. Russia has brought the war into our country and should feel what it has done, according to Ukrainian President Zelensky. Our expert on the current situation in the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine is Major General Dr. Christian Freuding, head of the Special Staff Ukraine at the Ministry of Defense.
I would like to welcome you to a new episode of Nachgefragt, General Dr. Freuding. Good afternoon, Captain. General, you've just come from Ukraine yourself and you also have some insights to share. Ukrainian troops have now advanced into Russian territory. What information do we have on this? What can you tell us at this point in time?
Let's talk about the Kursk region. Last Tuesday, August 6th, Ukrainian forces attacked the Kursk region on 4 axes, as shown here. The strength of the Ukrainian forces for this offensive operation is 4 brigades. That is 4,000 to 6,000 soldiers. The depth of the area taken is approximately 30 kilometers. The width is around 65 kilometers. We estimate that the total area in which Ukrainian forces are operating rather than controlling is around 1,000 square kilometers. That's interesting because that's roughly the size of the area that the Ukrainian forces have lost to the Russian forces since the beginning of the year. So that gives us a good indication. We also know that in addition to these 4,000 to 6,000 soldiers of the Ukrainian armed forces in the area of the Russian Kursk Oblast, these forces are also supported by around 2,000 to 4,000 Ukrainian forces from the Sumy area, in particular by logistics, but also by air defense forces. We also know that this has led to around 100,000 Russians being relocated from this region, being moved to the interior of the country, which the Russian government has also made quite public. What are the Russian armed forces doing about it? They are trying to counter this Ukrainian attack with infantry, armored forces and special forces. We know that armor has been introduced and deployed on a massive scale here too, as well as close air support. So far, however, this has not been successful.
General, what are the intentions behind the Ukrainian offensive? What is Ukraine trying to achieve?
Ukraine has multiple intentions. The first point is, of course, to create relief. The Ukrainian defense in the Donbass is under enormous pressure, so this is a targeted relief attack. That is one point. The second point is, of course, a psychological aspect. Zelensky himself has said in public that he wants to take the war into the Russian heartland. But thirdly, it is also a psychological effect to show the Ukrainian population internally that yes, we are in a position to go on the offensive again, to take the initiative again. Yes, we will not tolerate the daily shelling from this area and the resulting civilian casualties, which is a real encouragement for the Ukrainian population. Of course, it is also the case that the Ukrainians had prepared this operation very, very well. They had very good reconnaissance results. They knew that in the area where they were now under attack, firstly, the terrain was favorable for an offensive operation, and secondly, that there was a massing of poorly trained troops, presumably reserve forces, and that there were important logistical facilities, important logistical lines of communication. In other words, this was also a window of opportunity for the Ukrainian armed forces. And ultimately, of course, it is an opportunity for Ukraine if they manage to hold on to this captured space in the longer term or even permanently to use it as a political bargaining chip in the future.
You mentioned this offensive, but such a massive offensive with so many brigades may also mean a counter-reaction. Should we expect a massive Russian offensive in the next few days, or are there already preparations that we can observe?
We saw immediately at the beginning that the Russian forces are able to react When the Ukrainians advanced, there was an attempt to counterattack. The Ukrainians had obviously foreseen this in their operational planning and were able to smash these forces as they approached. Of course, we can now see that the Russian forces are bringing in additional forces. From what we can see, these are independent forces. We even know that forces from western areas, from Kaliningrad, are now moving into this area. As far as we can see, they have not yet withdrawn any or hardly any forces from their central offensive groupings in Donbass. It is to be expected that the Russian forces are preparing these counterattacks, but the Ukrainian forces are also prepared to respond.
If we observe this operation now anyway, is it also possible that we will see Ukrainian offensives in other parts of the border region in the near future? For many observers, this momentum came as quite a surprise.
The Ukrainians have now made the experience that they have achieved success there through surprise, through movement, through speed. I'm also speaking a bit as the commander of a former armored brigade, that they have regained the initiative, and I assume that they have other options of a comparable nature in their operational planning.
The operation we are observing in the Kursk region also has certain consequences. So did the Ukrainians also take Russian prisoners of war, for example? And if so, how are they dealing with this?
We assume that the Ukrainians took a high three-digit, if not four-digit number of prisoners of war. As far as we know, most of them were or are conscripts, and we assume that they were captured in accordance with the rules of the international law of war.
You just mentioned international law yourself. We now have a completely different situation in that, for the first time since the start of the war of aggression against Ukraine in violation of international law, Russian troops are being pushed back, even onto their own territory. In other words, is Ukraine now still active in any way within the framework of international law in accordance with the United Nations Charter, Article 21, the right of self-defense? Of course it is.
Donbass, Ukraine is defending itself in accordance with Article 21 of the United Nations Charter. International law has no two opinions on that either. It is quite clear that Ukraine is defending itself and can, of course, also conduct this defense on Russian territory.
Clearly
the aggressor
Russia. Does that
clearly
mean, so to speak, that nothing would change in terms of international law? No. So nevertheless, we must also consider that material supplied by Germany or partner nations is also being used in this offensive. Are we perhaps becoming a party to the war after all? What is your position on this?
Yes, of course. There are two aspects to consider. Firstly, we would have to be involved in an act of direct harm. That is clearly not the case. And the second, and perhaps even more relevant aspect, is that we are not talking about German military equipment, but about Ukrainian Martins. We are talking about Ukrainian Bradleys. We are talking about Ukrainian Caesar self-propelled howitzers, which are being used in accordance with the ideas, specifications, and orders of the Ukrainian Armed Forces Command.
So the situation here is also clear. We have now kept the focus very much on the Kursk region. Despite everything, there are still many thousands of kilometers of front line. How is the situation on the ground? Have we seen any changes? Are there any advances by the Russians? Are the Russians already having to retreat because the forces in the north have to be tied down? How are things moving on the other front sections of the districts?
Of course, the media interest at the moment is on this small section. In fact, the focus of the Russian forces, the focus of the overall operation remains the Donbass. It is also shown here on the map. It is also true that neither the Ukrainian side nor the Russian side are currently withdrawing any forces from the central fighting in the Donbass for what is happening up here. That remains the main focus. That is also where most of the shooting and dying is taking place. This section, Avdiivka, Kasivjar, is certainly central at the moment. The Russians are succeeding in advancing there every day through small but steady gains in terrain. In Kasivjar, they have even managed to cross the Sieversky Donetsk Canal in some places. They were able to form smaller bridgeheads. Despite well-developed defensive positions, the Ukrainian defenders were unable to push the Russian forces back to the eastern bank of the canal. This is definitely a critical situation in the area, as we have often talked about the superior positions around Kasivchar from a geographical perspective. If the Russians succeed in taking Kasivchar, this will open the door further west, so to speak. Time and again, there are situations in this area of Kasivchar, Adivka situations, in which the Ukrainian forces are outflanked, which then forces the Ukrainian forces to straighten out the front and withdraw their positions. In this respect, despite the initiative up in the north, here in the central Donbass, we are talking about an unchanging critical situation for the defense of Ukraine.
You describe a critical defense situation in the center of gravity of eastern Ukraine, and at the same time we have the offensive movement in the north. Wouldn't it perhaps make more sense to deploy these forces for defense purposes in eastern Ukraine just when the channel has been crossed?
Wherever the military leader has the opportunity to take the initiative, he must use it. According to my impressions and conversations, the Ukrainians are well aware of the risk they are taking with this operation, but there can be considerable momentum if this operation is carried out successfully, and that's why I can well understand why they decided to start this operation despite the risk.
To what extent is this dynamic affected if we now talk about the fact that there is a delivery of FXV multi-role combat aircraft which are suitable for both air defense and attacks on ground targets? Do we already have a development that we can report on?
Well, people always use this game changer argument, which I don't agree with in any way. I think I've said that here more than once, and that applies not only to the FZECTAN, but also to main battle tanks, artillery systems, and air defense systems. Not a single weapon system is and will be a game changer. You said it right, the FZECTAN can basically be used for two roles, one for air defense and one for direct support of land forces. In my opinion, these are also the two types of operation in which this aircraft is used. We are currently assuming that we are talking about a very low double-digit number of aircraft that can currently be deployed in Ukraine. Of course, they first have to be integrated into the overall architecture of air warfare. These aircraft, which certainly make the Russians nervous, will be exposed to tremendous, I'll call it, tracking pressure. As far as we know, the Russians have already offered bounties for the destruction of these aircraft. This means that they will be forced to keep changing airfields with every flight. This naturally has an impact on the logistical supply capability, and we will see what effect they can actually have. Now in direct operations, the area where I expect them to have the greatest effect is against the Russian aircraft types that carry these glide bombs. Now I have my flip chart back. If you imagine the very rough sketch, these glide bombs will be used against the Ukrainian forces on the front line at a distance of around 60 to 90 kilometers. We assume that the F-16s can be armed with weapons, air warfare weapons, which have a range of 100 plus kilometers. This means that they can act against the carriers of the glide bombs before the glide bombs can be used effectively. Of course, it is also true that the Russians have different types of aircraft in a fighter role with ranges of well over 100 kilometers and would in turn be able to fight the FXV. In order to do this, however, they need something like an overall air defense architecture, command centers, and reconnaissance assets. These are currently significantly reduced on the Russian side, decimated by targeted attacks on such aircraft by the Ukrainian armed forces in recent weeks and months. In this respect, we will now have to see what effect this dynamic has on the battlefield.
On the one hand, you have now mentioned the Russian air defense with individual weak points, but let's also take another look at Ukraine. There is also an air defense there, and a lot of civilian infrastructure, critical infrastructure, is still being attacked there on a regular basis. What is the current situation there? So have the attacks subsided? Is the pressure from the Ukrainians noticeable?
No.
Or is it...
So the attacks have not abated. The air defense is indeed an unchanging weak point. Despite everything that has been achieved, despite the fact that we once again succeeded at the NATO summit in ensuring that the Ukrainian armed forces are provided with additional air defense systems despite our delivery, despite the introduction of the FX-Sivai. We have the challenge that we need the air defense systems, firstly to protect the critical casualty structure, and secondly to protect the population centers. We need them to protect the troops deployed directly at the front. We now also need them up on course to accompany the attack. Despite all their efforts, there are not that many air defense and anti-aircraft systems available, although the Ukrainians are also able to combine them into a very clever architecture. In other words, this is and remains a weak point, which of course the Russians are exploiting.
We also keep seeing unusual movements, if you can put it that way. There are isolated soldiers on buggies, quads, motorcycles, isolated armored vehicles. It looks less like a major offensive. How can you explain this from a tactical perspective? Why do we see such images? What is the purpose of this?
Well, this is not born out of necessity, that the Russians no longer have any armored combat vehicles. On the contrary, we know that the production and recovery rate of the Russians generally at least replaces the failure rate for most of the combat vehicles. This can be explained a little in terms of action-reaction, i.e. what happens tactically and how the enemy reacts to it. At the beginning of the war, we saw very, very strong massing of forces. Then came the drone developments, and now we are seeing developments towards isolation on the battlefield. That would be my simple, very simplistic explanation.
We have now talked about the situation in the north of Ukraine, about the Kursk region. We have observed the east of Ukraine. The Russian war of aggression has now been going on for over 2.5 years. Can Ukraine actually still win?
Of course, Ukraine can win, as we can see with this offensive operation, that it can take the initiative, that it can achieve successes, that it can inflict considerable pain on Russia. And I believe this is a good indicator that the Ukrainian armed forces still have the will and the ability to succeed in this war and to win it.
And assuming victory, what might such a victory look like? What would a victory be for Ukraine?
To win. Of course, it is up to the Ukrainians to define what winning means. The goal is clear: to restore its territorial integrity and sovereignty within the internationally recognized borders of the years 1991. My assessment is not that the Ukrainians believe that all this will be achieved, but their goal must be to be in a position militarily to achieve their political goal on the timeline. And that is also the reason why we are continuing to support them.
We can, want to, and must. In other words, Germany's support for Ukraine is still important.
Absolutely. I considered it morally imperative. It is in our security policy interests. It is in line with alliance policy. What do I mean by that? With the pledge to Ukraine from the summit decisions, NATO summit decisions in Vilnius last year and in Washington a few months ago, the path is laid out that we will integrate the Ukrainian armed forces beyond the immediate material support into the force structures after membership. And fourthly, of course, it is also militarily necessary in order to give the Ukrainians the opportunity to wage this war successfully, which in turn leads back to our first point.
The moral imperative. Many questions also focus on why Germany is not supplying even more weapons, even more ammunition, even more material to Ukraine and procuring it anew.
Germany is the biggest supporter after the United States. This year alone, we will spend between 6.5 and 7 billion on military support for Ukraine. If you look at the entire period of the war, then we are looking at a total of over 20 billion in support that has been provided or is secured under contract and has been promised. I think that is very, very impressive. Right at the beginning, we were very quick to dispose of a large number of items from the Bundeswehr stocks and then immediately initiated the procurement process. Of course, it will still take some time before this replacement is produced and flows back into the troop structures. We are now taking a much more balanced view of the Bundeswehr's handover. Why are we taking a much more balanced view? Because, of course, we have a target that in 5 to 8 years' time we have to achieve the highest possible level of operational readiness with regard to Russian reconstitution capabilities. That is why we are now looking much more closely at what can be supplied by industry, and we have signed extensive contracts that are now being delivered, that will be delivered in the coming years, and that will significantly strengthen the Ukrainian armed forces. Can you be specific about this?
What is to be delivered?
We can take a brief look at what is planned for this year alone, among other things. This is just a very rough overview. You see air defense systems, IRIS-T, short and medium range. We will continue our GPAD delivery. We will also supply additional guided missiles for the IRIS-T air defense systems. We will become much more involved in the area of drones and drone defense. We will also be supplying large artillery systems, 12 self-propelled howitzers, 2004 howitzers from Slovakian production. The first RCH-150 will be delivered at the turn of the year. Ukraine will be the first country to use this new modern weapon system. We will also continue with armored combat vehicles, Leopard 1 AV, MRAP type protected combat vehicles. We will continue to provide logistical support, hand weapons, hand weapon ammunition on a large scale, and last but not least, we will also continue our support in the area of medical supplies.
First overview.
That's just a rough.
At the beginning of the interview, you said that you had just been to Ukraine yourself, so you were there. What were your impressions there? What perhaps moved or impressed you most about what you were able to experience there?
Tip the organization, discipline, professionalism, bravery, and courage of the Ukrainian armed forces. And with the Ukrainians, this courage to face life and the unconditional.
The will to freedom? Mr. General, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for your personal impressions of Ukraine, and thank you very much for the interview. See you next time. With pleasure. See you next time. General Dr. Freuding reported on his personal impressions of his visit to Ukraine. Ukraine itself has taken the initiative and is operating on Russian territory. However, Russian pressure in the Donbass continues. This makes further support from Germany all the more important. This was In Demand. You can find more information at bundeswehr.de and on our social media. See you next time.